"Girls like you don't speak in my presence," Ethan Caldwell said without raising his voice. Yet the words carried across the entire dining room like a cold draft, silencing forks mid-air and freezing conversations at nearby tables, as if someone had turned down the volume of the world itself. The restaurant, a high-end steakhouse in downtown Chicago, glowed with amber lighting reflecting off polished walnut walls and crystal glasses, the kind of place where a single dinner bill could match a week's salary. And yet in that moment, none of the wealth in the room felt louder than the quiet that followed his sentence. Ava Brooks stood still beside the table, her tray balanced carefully in one hand, the faint scent of seared ribeye and buttered asparagus rising into the air between them, her posture straight not from confidence, but from discipline learned over years of staying unnoticed, her dark uniform crisp but modest, her name tag catching a sliver of light that flickered each time someone shifted in their seat nearby. She had only been working there for 6 days, still memorizing table numbers, still learning which guests preferred silence and which demanded attention. But everyone already knew Ethan Caldwell, the man whose presence made managers nervous and waitstaff cautious, a billionaire investor whose reputation for control was as sharp as the crease in his tailored navy suit, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room because the room had already decided to obey him. A few tables over, a couple stopped mid-conversation, eyes flicking toward Ava before quickly looking away, as if witnessing something they didn't want to be part of, while a server near the bar subtly stepped back, lowering his gaze, the unspoken rule clear: don't get involved, don't be noticed, don't make it worse. Ava lowered the tray slightly, her fingers steady despite the weight, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but her face composed, the kind of calm that didn't come from ease but from knowing what it meant when things went wrong, from watching her mother work double shifts cleaning office floors at night, from seeing bills stack up on a kitchen counter that never seemed to clear, from understanding that one mistake in the wrong moment could cost more than just a job. Ethan didn't look at her again after speaking, already turning his attention back to the contract laid open in front of him, a thick stack of papers clipped neatly, a gold pen resting across the signature line like a final step waiting to be taken, while 2 men in expensive suits leaned in slightly, their smiles polite but tight, the kind of smiles that hid urgency beneath professionalism. "Where's the manager?" one of them murmured under his breath, not loud enough to interrupt, but just enough to signal discomfort, though no one moved to call for one, because everyone understood the hierarchy in that room, and Ethan Caldwell sat at the top of it. Ava's eyes drifted for a fraction of a second to the document on the table, not out of curiosity but recognition, something about the layout, the spacing, the dense legal language packed into narrow margins, something that felt familiar in a way that tightened her chest, like a memory brushing against the surface without fully forming. And then she looked back at Ethan, who had already picked up the pen, his fingers relaxed, confident, unaware of the stillness around him, unaware that for the first time since she had stepped into that room, Ava Brooks didn't feel invisible anymore. The pen hovered just above the paper, less than an inch from the signature line, and in that narrow space between ink and decision, Ava felt the weight of something far larger than a dinner shift pressing against her chest, a quiet pressure that had nothing to do with the room and everything to do with what she had seen before, not here, not in this restaurant, but years ago at a kitchen table where numbers did not add up and contracts did not make sense until it was too late. She adjusted her grip on the tray, setting it down slowly on the edge of the table with a soft clink that barely registered against the low hum of the dining room. But to her it sounded loud, deliberate, like placing a marker in time, and for a brief second her reflection flickered across the polished surface of a wine glass, steady eyes, controlled breath, a person who had learned how to stay quiet even when everything inside said to speak. Around her, the staff moved carefully, almost cautiously, as if the air itself had become fragile, a manager near the host's stand pretending to review a reservation list while clearly watching from a distance, another server pausing mid-step before turning away, everyone aware that this table was not just another table, that this moment was not just another interaction, and that crossing a line here could cost more than a reprimand. Ava's gaze shifted once more to the contract, to the layout of clauses and subclauses that mirrored documents she had once tried to understand late at night, sitting beside her father as he traced lines of text with a tired finger, whispering that it would be fine, that the deal would help them, that sometimes you just had to trust people who seemed to know more than you did. And she remembered the way his voice had carried both hope and uncertainty at the same time, the way the paper had looked official enough to feel safe, and the way everything had changed after the ink dried. Ethan's hand remained steady, his expression unreadable, his attention fixed on the page as if the rest of the room no longer existed. And yet Ava noticed the smallest detail, the slight tightening at the corner of his jaw, the subtle impatience in the way his fingers adjusted the pen, a man accustomed to decisions moving quickly, to outcomes bending in his favor, to never having to question what lay beneath the surface. One of the suited men leaned closer, his voice low but edged with urgency, saying that they were ready when he was, that everything had been reviewed, that there was no reason to delay, and the words sounded smooth, rehearsed, like a script delivered too many times to too many people, and Ava felt that same tightening in her chest again, sharper now, more defined, as if recognition had finally found its shape. She inhaled slowly, the scent of oak and grilled meat grounding her for a fraction of a second, and in that breath she weighed everything. The job she had just started, the hours she needed, the risk of being seen as out of line, the certainty that speaking would change how everyone in that room looked at her, and yet beneath all of that, there was something steadier, something that did not move with fear or consequence, something rooted in the memory of watching someone she loved sign a paper. He did not fully understand. The pen dipped slightly closer to the page, the distance closing, the moment narrowing, and Ava's fingers curled gently against the edge of the table, not gripping, not trembling, just holding her place in a world that had never really made space for her voice. And for the first time since she had stepped into that restaurant, she did not look away from the man in front of her, she did not lower her gaze, and she did not step back. "Do not sign that," Ava said, her voice calm but clear enough to reach across the table, cutting through the low murmur of the restaurant with a precision that made the air shift, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind of interruption that did not ask for permission and did not leave room to be ignored. The pen stopped, suspended just above the paper, and for a fraction of a second no one moved, as if the entire room had paused to decide whether what they had just heard was real or something imagined, a mistake, a breach of etiquette that would correct itself if ignored long enough. Ethan Caldwell did not look up immediately, but the stillness in his hand tightened, a subtle shift that revealed more than any raised voice could have. And when he finally lifted his eyes toward her, the temperature at the table seemed to drop, not because of anger, but because of attention, focused, sharp, and unaccustomed to being redirected. One of the suited men let out a small, incredulous laugh, the kind that tried to dissolve tension into something harmless. But it did not land. It lingered awkwardly in the space between them before fading into silence. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite on the surface but edged underneath, as if the words themselves were a formality rather than a question, and Ava did not respond to him, her gaze remaining on Ethan, steady, unwavering, not confrontational but certain, the kind of certainty that came from having seen the same pattern before and knowing exactly how it ended. Around them, the restaurant held its breath again, a glass paused halfway to someone's lips, a fork resting untouched against a plate. Even the soft jazz playing overhead seemed distant, like it belonged to a different room, because now the focus had narrowed to a single point, a waitress standing beside a table she was not supposed to influence, and a man who had built his entire world on being the one in control. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, not rushed, not defensive, but deliberate, as if he were giving the moment just enough space to reveal itself, his eyes scanning her face not for permission, but for explanation, and when he spoke, his voice was measured, almost quiet, but it carried a weight that made it clear he was not used to being interrupted. "You are speaking out of turn." It was not a question, not even a reprimand, just a statement of fact, a reminder of roles, of boundaries, of how things were supposed to work in a room like this. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the truth in his words without stepping back from them, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, fingers relaxed, posture composed, as if she had already accepted whatever consequence might follow. And then she spoke again, just as steady, just as clear. That clause on page 14 shifts all liability to you after the first quarter. The words settled heavily into the silence. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just precise, specific, and impossible to dismiss without being examined. One of the men across from Ethan reached instinctively for the document, flipping pages quickly, his movements controlled but faster than before, while the other adjusted his posture, his earlier confidence tightening into something more guarded. And for the first time since Ava had spoken, the balance at the table shifted, not completely, not visibly, but enough to be felt. Ethan's gaze did not leave her, but his hand lowered slightly, the pen no longer hovering over the signature line, now resting just above the paper without intention. And there was something different in his expression now, not belief, not yet, but curiosity, the kind that appeared when certainty was interrupted by something that refused to be easily dismissed. And how? He asked slowly, each word measured, controlled. Would you know that? It was not disbelief that shaped the question, but scrutiny, the need to understand the source before considering the claim, and Ava did not hesitate, not because she had rehearsed this moment, but because the truth did not require preparation, because it is written the same way my father lost everything, she said, her voice softer now, but no less steady, the words carrying a weight that did not need to be explained. And in that instant, the room did not just hear a waitress speaking. It felt the presence of something deeper, something rooted in experience rather than assumption. And for the first time since the contract had been placed on the table, the outcome no longer felt certain. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and precise. And for a moment no one at the table spoke, not because they agreed, but because the certainty in Ava's voice had disrupted the rhythm of a conversation that had been moving too smoothly for too long. And now that rhythm could not simply resume as if nothing had happened. The man holding the contract flipped back to the page she mentioned, slower this time, his fingers tracing the margin as if searching for something he had missed, while the other adjusted his cufflinks with a subtle movement that tried to maintain composure but revealed a shift beneath the surface, a tightening that had not been there before. Ethan remained still, his posture unchanged, but the pen was no longer poised to sign. It rested lightly against the paper without purpose, his attention divided now between the document and the woman standing beside his table, and though his expression remained controlled, there was a new layer beneath it, not trust, not yet, but attention sharpened by the possibility that something had slipped through. Page 14. He repeated quietly, not as a question, but as a directive, and the man across from him cleared his throat, offering a quick, practiced response about standard clauses and routine protections, his words smooth but slightly faster than before, as if speed could reinforce confidence, as if explanation alone could restore control. Ava did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, her presence steady, allowing the explanation to fill the space while the truth remained where she had placed it, unmoving, and the contrast between the polished language at the table and the simplicity of her warning became more pronounced with each passing second. Ethan reached for the contract himself, turning the pages with deliberate care, his fingers slowing as he reached the section in question, his eyes scanning line by line, not skimming, not assuming, but reading with the kind of focus that had likely built his fortune, and as he did, the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to recede further, conversations lowering, movements softening, as if the entire room understood that something was unfolding that did not belong to them, yet they could not look away. Ava's gaze remained forward, but her mind flickered briefly to a different table, a smaller one, worn wood instead of polished marble, where papers had once been spread out under a dim kitchen light, her father leaning in with the same concentration she now saw in Ethan, trusting the structure of the words, trusting the people who had presented them, believing that understanding most of it was enough. And she remembered how that belief had felt safe until it was not. One of the suited men shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, his voice lower now, suggesting that perhaps they could revisit the language later, that there was no need to delay the agreement over technicalities. But the word technicalities did not land the way he intended. It hung in the air, fragile, because it now competed with doubt, and doubt, once introduced, did not leave easily. Ethan's eyes paused on a specific line, just for a second longer than the rest, And though his face did not change, the stillness in his shoulders did, a subtle tightening that only someone watching closely might notice. And then he read the line again, slower this time, as if confirming what he had just seen, as if testing whether it meant what it appeared to mean. The man across from him spoke again, offering clarification, but his voice no longer carried the same effortless control. There was a faint edge now, a need to guide the interpretation, to steer the meaning back into something harmless. But the words no longer moved freely. They met resistance, not from argument, but from scrutiny. Ava did not step forward, did not add more. She had already said enough, and now she allowed the silence to do what it needed to do, to stretch, to settle, to force the truth into focus without being pushed. And in that silence, the power at the table shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably, because for the first time since the contract had been placed in front of him, Ethan Caldwell was no longer being told what the document said. He was seeing it for himself, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The line sat there, unchanged, undeniable, and the longer Ethan looked at it, the more the room seemed to close in around the table, not physically, but perceptibly, like the air itself had grown heavier with the weight of something no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. He did not speak right away, and that silence, coming from a man who was used to directing conversations, carried more tension than any raised voice could have, because it meant he was thinking, recalculating, stepping outside the momentum that had been carefully built for him. Across from him, the two men exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but said more than any explanation they had offered, a flicker of uncertainty that quickly disappeared behind composed expressions, but not quickly enough to go unnoticed. One of them leaned forward again, his tone now softer, more measured, suggesting that the clause was standard, that it was designed to streamline accountability, that in deals of this scale certain risks had to be centralized. But the language, once confident, now sounded like it was trying to convince rather than inform, and that difference was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the edge of the contract, a quiet, controlled movement, and then he turned another page, scanning forward, then back again, as if mapping the structure of the document in his mind, tracing how one clause connected to another, how responsibility shifted, how outcomes were distributed, and the more he read, the more deliberate his movements became, slower, more exact, as if he were dismantling something piece by piece. Ava remained where she was, neither stepping closer nor retreating, her presence steady but unobtrusive, allowing the process to unfold without interference, because she understood that this moment no longer belonged to her voice. It belonged to his realization, and realization, once it began, did not need to be pushed. Around them, the restaurant had resumed a fragile version of normal, but it was not the same. Conversations were quieter, glances more frequent, the awareness of what was happening at that table lingering in the background like a low note that would not fade. The manager had taken a few cautious steps closer, not enough to intrude, but enough to be ready, his posture tense, eyes shifting between Ava and Ethan, calculating risk, consequence, and the delicate balance of maintaining order in a space built on controlled experience. Ethan finally exhaled, not heavily, not dramatically, just a measured release of breath that marked a shift, and he set the pen down on the table, not tossed, not dropped, but placed with intention, parallel to the edge of the contract, as if drawing a line between what had been about to happen and what now required reconsideration. The sound of the pen touching the table was soft, almost insignificant, but in that moment it carried weight, because it meant the decision had stopped. One of the men straightened slightly, his smile returning, though thinner now, suggesting that perhaps they could revisit the language together, that adjustments could be made if necessary, that there was flexibility, always flexibility, but the word felt different now, no longer a reassurance, but a concession. Ethan did not respond to him immediately, his gaze shifting once more to Ava, not with the dismissive distance from before, but with a sharper focus, as if reassessing something he had already categorized and now realized did not fit where he had placed it. "You recognize that from experience," he said, not a question, but an acknowledgement, and Ava gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, her voice quiet when she replied, "Yes, sir." There was no elaboration, no attempt to persuade further, just the truth, simple and complete. The man across the table began to speak again, attempting to regain control of the conversation, but Ethan raised a hand slightly, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to pause him, and that single gesture, controlled and minimal, shifted the dynamic more clearly than anything else that had happened so far, because it showed where the authority in the room still resided, even as its direction changed. He closed the contract slowly, aligning the pages with precise movements, and for a moment he simply looked at it, as if considering not just the document, but the path that had led it here, the assumptions that had nearly carried it to completion, and the interruption that had stopped it. The room remained quiet, waiting, not for an answer, but for a reaction, and in that suspended moment, it became clear that what had begun as a routine dinner had turned into something else entirely, something that no longer followed the expected script, something shaped by a voice that had not been invited, but had proven impossible to ignore. The contract lay closed between Ethan's hands, its edges perfectly aligned, its weight now far greater than the paper it was made of, and for a long moment he did nothing with it. No movement, no decision, just stillness, the kind that follows when certainty has been interrupted and something deeper takes its place. The ambient glow of the restaurant softened around the table, light reflecting off polished surfaces and catching in the rim of untouched glasses, while a faint clink of silverware from distant tables returned in fragments, as if the world was slowly remembering how to move again. But at this table, time held its breath. Ava stood quietly, her hands resting lightly at her sides now, no longer anchored to the tray, her posture neither defensive nor assertive, simply present, and in that presence there was a calm that did not demand recognition. It existed without asking for it, the kind of calm that came from knowing she had already said what needed to be said. Ethan's gaze drifted once more to the contract, then back to her, and in that motion there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, the difference between looking past someone and actually seeing them, and for the first time since she had spoken, the space between them no longer felt defined by hierarchy alone. A soft breath left him, quieter than before, less measured, more human, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, not in dismissal, but in thought, as if creating distance from the decision he had nearly made. Around them, the two men sat straighter, their earlier confidence replaced by a careful restraint, waiting, watching, recalibrating their approach, but neither spoke, because whatever control they had held a few minutes ago no longer belonged entirely to them. Ava's eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, and for a fleeting moment the restaurant faded from her awareness, replaced by the image of a small kitchen lit by a single overhead bulb, the hum of an old refrigerator in the background, her father sitting at the table with papers spread out in front of him, his brow furrowed, his voice soft as he reassured her that everything would be fine, that this deal would change things, that sometimes risk was necessary, and she remembered how she had believed him, not because she understood the words on the page, but because she trusted the hope in his voice. The memory did not hurt the way it once had. It settled instead, like a quiet reminder of why she had spoken, why she could not stay silent even when silence would have been safer. Ethan watched her, not intrusively, but with a focus that had shifted from evaluation to understanding, and though he did not know her story, he recognized the weight behind her words, the kind that did not come from assumption or theory, but from lived consequence. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, lifting it slowly, the condensation cool against his fingers, and took a measured sip, not out of thirst, but to give the moment space, to let the implications settle fully before he moved forward. The glass returned to the table with a soft, controlled sound, and he exhaled again, this time more fully, as if releasing the last of the momentum that had carried him toward a decision he no longer trusted. The restaurant lights cast a warm reflection across the surface of the closed contract, turning the edges into lines of gold, and for a brief second, everything felt suspended, balanced between what had almost happened and what would happen next. Ava lifted her gaze again, meeting his without hesitation, and there was no challenge in her expression, no expectation, just clarity, the quiet certainty of someone who had done the right thing regardless of outcome. And in that shared stillness, without a word spoken, something shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, as if the room itself had recognized that power, real power, did not always come from authority or wealth, but from the courage to speak when it mattered most, and the willingness to listen when it did. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a current changing direction beneath the surface. And then Ethan reached forward, not toward the pen, but toward the contract, opening it again with deliberate care, turning back to the page Ava had pointed out, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the clause for a third time, not scanning, not assuming, but dissecting each word with the kind of precision that had built his reputation, and this time, something in his expression settled into place, not confusion, not curiosity, but recognition, the quiet, unmistakable recognition of a flaw that had been designed to hide in plain sight. He traced the line with his finger, following the structure of the sentence, the way responsibility shifted subtly across commas and subclauses, the way the language appeared balanced on the surface but tilted heavily beneath. And then he leaned back again, slower than before, his gaze lifting from the page to the two men across from him. And for the first time since the meeting began, there was no trace of assumption in his eyes, only clarity. "This is not standard," he said, his voice calm, measured, but firm in a way that did not invite immediate rebuttal. And the words landed differently than anything that had been spoken so far, because they did not come from interruption or suggestion, they came from conclusion. One of the men opened his mouth to respond, his posture shifting forward as if to regain ground, but Ethan raised his hand again, just slightly, the same controlled gesture as before, and the man stopped mid-sentence, the interruption silent, but absolute. It transfers full downstream liability under the appearance of shared risk. Ethan continued, his tone even, analytical, as if he were now explaining the document rather than being guided through it. And as he spoke, the balance of the conversation shifted completely, the authority returning to him, but no longer in the direction it had been flowing earlier. The second man adjusted his tie, offering a careful smile, suggesting that the language could be clarified, that adjustments were always part of the process, but the ease was gone now, replaced by calculation, by the need to respond rather than lead. Ethan closed the contract again, this time with finality, his fingers resting on the cover for a brief second before sliding it slightly away from him, creating a small but definitive distance between himself and the agreement. "We are not signing this tonight," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that required no emphasis, and the statement settled into the space like a final note, clear and irreversible. The two men exchanged another glance, this one longer, heavier, their composure intact but their position undeniably weakened, and though they attempted to maintain professionalism, the shift in the room was complete, the momentum no longer theirs to control. Around them, the restaurant seemed to exhale, the subtle tension that had been building finally releasing. Conversations resuming in low murmurs, movement returning in careful increments. But the awareness of what had just happened lingered, a quiet ripple that would not fully disappear. Ethan's gaze moved once more, this time back to Ava, and the difference in that look was unmistakable, not softened, not sentimental, but recalibrated, as if he were seeing her without the filter of assumption for the first time. He studied her for a brief moment, not long enough to make it uncomfortable, but long enough to acknowledge the role she had played, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight, less about control, more about recognition. "You stopped me from making a very expensive mistake," he said, each word deliberate, not exaggerated, not diminished, simply stated as fact, and in that statement there was something rare, not gratitude in the traditional sense, but acknowledgement from a man who did not offer it lightly. Ava did not react immediately, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. Because the moment was not about validation, it was about truth, and the truth had already been established. She gave a small nod, not as acceptance of praise, but as confirmation of what had been prevented, and in that quiet exchange, without raised voices or dramatic gestures, the reversal was complete, not loud, not triumphant, but undeniable, the kind that left a room changed long after the moment itself had passed. The words settled between them, not heavy, not forced, but final, and for a moment no one moved to fill the space that followed. as if anything added too quickly might disturb the balance that had just been restored. Ethan remained seated, his hand resting lightly on the table near the closed contract, his posture no longer rigid with control, but grounded in something quieter, something more deliberate. And when he looked at Ava again, it was without the distance that had defined his earlier gaze, without the assumption that had placed her outside the conversation before she ever spoke. The two men across from him gathered their papers with careful precision, their movements composed but restrained, the easy confidence from earlier replaced by a professional withdrawal. And though they maintained polite expressions, the shift in the room made it clear that the direction of the evening had changed in a way they could not recover from with words alone. "We will revisit this," one of them said, his tone measured, controlled, but lacking the authority it had carried before, and Ethan gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, his attention already moving beyond them. As they stood and adjusted their jackets, the faint sound of chairs sliding against the floor echoed softly, and then they stepped away from the table, blending back into the low hum of the restaurant, their presence fading as quickly as it had once commanded attention. The space they left behind felt different, quieter, as if something unnecessary had been removed, leaving only what remained essential. Ethan reached for the glass of water again, but this time he did not drink. He simply held it for a second before setting it back down, his gaze drifting briefly toward the city lights visible through the tall windows, reflections of traffic and movement stretching across the glass like distant lines of motion, and then he turned back to Ava. "What is your name?" he asked, not abruptly, not out of formality, but with intention, as if the answer mattered now in a way it had not before. "Ava Brooks," she replied, her voice steady, neither elevated nor softened, simply present, and he repeated it once under his breath, not to memorize, but to place it, to recognize it. A faint shift of expression crossed his face, subtle enough that most would not notice, but it carried the weight of someone reconsidering more than just a moment, reconsidering the framework through which he had been viewing the people around him. "You said your father lost everything to something like this," he continued, his tone quieter now, not probing, but seeking understanding, and Ava nodded once, her eyes steady, her answer simple. "Yes, sir." There was no elaboration, no attempt to draw sympathy, just a statement of fact, and in that simplicity there was a kind of strength that did not require explanation. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing the words, and for a brief moment his gaze lowered to the table, to the space where the contract had been, as if tracing the line between what had almost happened and what had been avoided, and when he looked up again, there was a clarity in his expression that had not been there before, not just about the deal, but about the moment itself. "Most people would have stayed silent," he said, not as praise, but as observation, and Ava's response came without hesitation, just as quiet, just as grounded. "Someone should not." The words hung there, simple, direct, and for a second Ethan did not respond, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to challenge, only something to understand. He gave a small nod, more to himself than to her, and then he reached for the edge of the table, pushing his chair back with a controlled motion as he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the moment was moving forward, but not away from what had just happened. Around them, the restaurant had returned to its rhythm, conversations flowing, glasses clinking, the soft music weaving back into the space. But at that table, something had shifted in a way that would not simply blend back into the background. Something quiet, something lasting, carried not in words, but in the way two people now stood in the same space without the barrier that had once defined it. The chair settled back into place with a soft, controlled sound, and Ethan remained standing for a brief moment, not moving away, not speaking further, just present in the space as it was now, a space that no longer felt divided by roles or expectations, but held together by something quieter, something that did not need to be named. Ava reached for the tray she had set down earlier, her fingers wrapping around its edge with the same steady control she had carried throughout the evening, and she lifted it without haste, without tension, as if the weight had never been anything more than what it appeared to be. The warm light from above traced a soft line across the small metal name tag pinned to her uniform, catching the engraved letters for just a second before fading again, and in that brief reflection, her name stood out clearly, not announced, not emphasized, just seen. Around them, the restaurant moved forward, the low hum of conversation returning to its natural rhythm, glasses touching lightly, quiet laughter weaving through the air. But at this table, the stillness lingered just a moment longer, as if it needed time to settle into memory before dissolving completely. Ethan stepped aside slightly, not as a gesture of formality, but as a simple acknowledgement of her movement, creating space without instruction, without expectation, and Ava inclined her head just once in response, not as submission, but as recognition, the kind that passes between people who understand something without needing to explain it. She turned then, her steps measured and quiet against the polished floor, moving away from the table and back into the flow of the room, her presence blending again with the rhythm of service, but not disappearing, not in the way it had before, because something about her had shifted, or perhaps something about how she was seen had. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, his gaze following her path only briefly before returning to the table, to the empty space where the contract had been, and he placed his hand lightly against the surface, not searching, not deciding, just grounding himself in the moment that had just passed. The city lights beyond the windows flickered in reflection, distant headlights moving like quiet streaks across the glass, and for a moment, everything felt still again, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved in a way that did not require words. A server passed by in the distance, the soft sound of footsteps blending into the ambient noise, and somewhere near the bar, a glass was set down with a gentle clink, the kind of ordinary sound that marked the return of normalcy, yet the memory of what had happened at the table remained, carried not in volume, but in meaning. Ava reached the service station near the kitchen entrance, placing the tray down with the same quiet precision, her hands pausing for just a fraction of a second before moving again, continuing her work as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that settled beneath the surface, steady and lasting. Back at the table, Ethan adjusted his jacket slightly, a small, habitual motion, and then he took one final look at the space in front of him before turning toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his posture composed, but his expression carrying a quiet awareness that had not been there before. The door opened softly as he approached, a brief wash of cooler night air slipping into the warmth of the room before fading again as it closed behind him, and inside, the restaurant continued, unchanged on the surface, yet somewhere within it, in the reflection of light on glass. In the space between movement and stillness, the echo of a moment remained, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably present, like the quiet sound of something true finally being heard.